From the sky, the Guyana Shield is an endless ocean of green. It is one of the oldest geological formations on Earth, a dense, impenetrable rainforest that stretches across the northern edge of South America. There are no walls here, no fences, just rivers, mountains, and trees. But buried deep within this jungle is a line. It is invisible from the air, yet it carries enough weight to drag the entire Western Hemisphere into war. To the east lies Guyana, a tiny nation of just 800,000 people, English-speaking, culturally Caribbean, and suddenly violently rich. To the west lies Venezuela, a regional giant, Spanish-speaking, boasting the world's largest proven oil reserves, yet gripped by an economic collapse so severe it has emptied the country of millions of its citizens. One jungle, two nations, and between them, a dispute over a territory the size of Florida. For over a century, this border was just a quiet disagreement on old colonial maps. But today, that silence has been broken. The discovery of massive wealth beneath the ocean has turned this invisible line into a flashpoint for global powers. The U.S. is moving warships, Brazil is mobilizing tanks, and Venezuela is rewriting its maps. So how did a 19th century surveyor's mistake become a 21st century crisis? Why is the world's newest oil superpower at risk of disappearing? And can a line drawn by a dead empire really trigger a modern war? This is the story of the Essequibo, the invisible line that could reshape South America forever. Long before modern borders existed, this region was a colonial frontier. Spain claimed the west, the Dutch claimed the east. But in 1814, the Dutch ceded their colonies of Essequibo, Demerara, and Berbice to Britain. The British united them to form British Guyana. The problem? No one had ever agreed on where the Spanish territory ended and the British territory began. Spain, and later independent Venezuela, claimed their border stretched all the way to the Essequibo River. Britain, hungry for resources, pushed their claim further west. In 1835, the British commissioned a Prussian explorer named Robert Schomburgk to map their new colony. Schomburgk plunged into the jungle and drew a line, the Schomburgk Line. It was a cartographer's ambitious stroke that swallowed an extra 30,000 square miles of territory compared to previous maps. Venezuela was furious. They saw it as an imperial land grab. For decades, diplomatic tensions simmered until the United States, enforcing the Monroe Doctrine, stepped in to pressure Britain into arbitration. In 1899, an international tribunal met in Paris to settle the matter once and for all. The panel, composed of British, American, and Russian jurists, reached a unanimous decision. They awarded Britain over 90% of the disputed territory, formalizing the Schomburgk Line as the official border. At the time, Venezuela ratified the decision. The map was set. The line was drawn. For 60 years, the border was a fact of geography. But in history, silence rarely lasts. In 1962, just as British Guyana was preparing for independence, Venezuela dropped a bombshell. They declared the 1899 award null and void, citing evidence of a secret political deal between the British and Russian judges to cheat Venezuela out of its land. When Guyana became independent in 1966, it was born with a target on its back. It inherited a neighbor who claimed 2/3 of its national territory was stolen property. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the hidden lines that shape our world, consider subscribing to Borderline History. It helps me keep the lights on and the maps rendering. Now, back to the jungle. For decades, the dispute over the Guyana Essequibo was a diplomatic Cold War. It was fought with speeches, stamps, and maps, but rarely with bullets. The region itself remained largely undeveloped. a vast expanse of rainforest, gold mines, and indigenous villages, disconnected from the power centers of both Caracas and Georgetown. Then, in 2015, the ground shifted, or rather, the seabed did. ExxonMobil, drilling in the Stabroek Block, roughly 120 miles off the coast of the disputed territory, struck liquid gold. They found high-quality crude oil, a lot of it. Over the next few years, discovery followed discovery. The estimated reserves ballooned to over 11 million barrels. To put that in perspective, Guyana now has more oil per capita than Saudi Arabia or Kuwait. Almost overnight, Guyana transformed. The economy skyrocketed, growing by over 60% in a single year, the fastest growth rate on the planet. For a small, developing nation, it was like winning the geopolitical lottery. But across the border, the story was tragically different. While Guyana's star was rising, Venezuela was in free fall. Despite sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, mismanagement, corruption, and crippling U.S. sanctions had decimated its oil industry. Production collapsed to a fraction of its peak. Hyperinflation made the currency worthless. Shortages of food and medicine drove over 7 million Venezuelans to flee their homeland. The contrast was brutal. On one side of the line, an economic miracle fueled by foreign investment. On the other, a humanitarian catastrophe. And crucially, that oil was found in waters that project out from the disputed Essequibo coastline. If Venezuela owns the land, they argue, they own the exclusive economic zone extending from it. They own the oil. The sleeping giant had woken up, and it was hungry. In geopolitics, when legal avenues stall, nations often turn to theater. And in late 2023, the theater of the Essequibo dispute turned dangerous. With elections approaching and popularity waning, the Venezuelan government dusted off the centuries-old grievance. They launched a massive nationalist campaign, framing the Essequibo not just as disputed land, but as stolen Venezuelan soil. On December 3, 2023, Venezuela had a controversial referendum. They asked their citizens 5 questions. The most critical one: should Venezuela create a new state called Guyana Essequiba, grant citizenship to its residents, and reject the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, which was currently reviewing the case? The government claimed an overwhelming victory, a 95% yes vote. Days later, the president of Venezuela stood before a map on national television. But it wasn't the map the world knew. It was a new map. The Essequibo region was no longer striped or grayed out. It was solid Venezuelan territory. He ordered the state oil company to create divisions for the new territory. He appointed a general as the region's sole authority. He signed decrees effectively annexing the land on paper. To the world, this looked like a symbolic move, politics for a domestic audience. But lines on a map have a funny way of demanding reality. Guyana, with a military force of fewer than 5,000 active personnel, watched in alarm as rhetoric turned into mobilization. Satellite imagery began to tell a worrying story. Airstrips near the border were being expanded. Light tanks and patrol boats were moving east. The Paper Annexation was starting to look like a preparation for something much more physical. This is where the invisible line stops being a local dispute and starts looking like a global chessboard. Guyana knew it couldn't defend the Essequibo alone, so it turned to the very power that Venezuela has positioned itself against for decades, the United States. For Washington, this isn't just about protecting a small democracy, it's about energy security. The oil in Guyana is extracted largely by American corporations. It represents a stable, non-OPEC source of energy in the Western Hemisphere. The response was swift. The U.S. Southern Command began conducting flight operations over Guyana. High-ranking military officials visited Georgetown. The message to Caracas was clear: do not cross the line. But Venezuela had friends too. The regime had strengthened ties with Russia, China, and Iran, nations that are more than happy to see the U.S. distracted by a crisis in its own backyard. Russia had supplied military hardware to Venezuela for years. China is a major creditor. Suddenly, the jungle border isn't just about 1899 or Robert Schomburg. It's a friction point between East and West. And then there's the giant to the south, Brazil. Brazil shares a border with both nations, and critically, the impenetrable terrain of the Essequibo jungle means that any large-scale ground invasion from Venezuela would likely need to pass through Brazilian territory to be effective. Brazil's response? They didn't wait. They mobilized armored vehicles to the border state of Roraima. They tripled their troop presence. The message from Brasilia was simple: no war on our continent, and definitely no war through our backyard. What started as a legal argument over a colonial map has now drawn in the U.S. military, the Brazilian army, and the shadow of Russian influence. The line in the jungle is now crowded with guns. Today, the Essequibo remains under Guyanese control. The oil rigs are still pumping. The courts in The Hague are still deliberating. But the tension is palpable. The new border Venezuela declared exists only in decrees and school textbooks, but the intent behind it hasn't vanished. The tragedy of the Essequibo is that it is a conflict born of two desperate realities. For Guyana, the territory is existential. It is 2/3 of their home, the source of their water, their gold, and now their future prosperity. To lose it would be to cease existing as a viable nation. For the Venezuelan government, the claim is a potent rallying cry, a way to unify a fractured populace against a common external enemy, a historical theft that distracts from the crushing economic reality at home. Can a diplomatic solution be found? The International Court of Justice will eventually issue a ruling, but Venezuela has already said it doesn't recognize the court's authority on this matter. If history has taught us anything, it's that borders are fragile things. They are drawn in ink, but often redrawn in blood. Right now, the line in the jungle is holding, but with billions of barrels of oil at stake and warships patrolling the Caribbean, it is a line under immense pressure. One jungle, two worlds, and a border that is dangerously close to the breaking point. Thanks for watching Borderline History. If you want to understand another invisible line that divided a continent, click here to watch our video on Haiti versus the Dominican Republic. See you on the next map.